Hello, Mark.
Hi there, Rupert.
I'm in an unfamiliar environment. I'm in Gloucestershire at the moment, staying in the house of my son Cosmo and his wife Flora. That's why it looks different from usual.
It
Uh,
looks like another room filled with plants and various natural forms, though, which is familiar from your own home as well.
yes, indeed. And indeed, one of my jobs here is to water the plants, and they're all doing quite well at the moment. um, Mark, today what I'd like to talk about is how can praying be taught? Um, And one reason I'm interested in this is that it's very easy to learn how to meditate. There are hundreds of places you can learn how to meditate. There are courses online, there are meditation centers, there are many forms of meditation. Um, there are even online courses given by Sam Harris, the new atheist. So meditation is extremely widespread. At least 18 million people in the United States meditate regularly. It's taught in schools, in prisons. There's a meditation group in the House of Commons, and so on. It's very, very widespread. Yet prayer, which is a much more traditional form of personal spiritual practice and collective spiritual practice, is not taught very obviously anywhere. It's in churches, it's simply assumed that people know how to do it. Outside churches, a lot of people do actually pray, but there's no one running courses on it that I've come across, and there's very little in the way of instruction. And in seminars and in talks I've given in recent years, I've often asked people, how many people here meditate or have meditated? And it's usually about 80%. Lots and lots of people have meditated. And then I say, how many people pray or have prayed? And it's about 20%. It's vastly more meditation than prayer. And 50 years ago, most people wouldn't have heard of meditation and most people would have prayed.
I wonder whether part of the difference there is that whilst meditation can fit a secular world, because you can imagine meditation just as going on in sort of inside your head or maybe inside your body mind. Prayer does imply an engagement with awareness, consciousness, at least a presence beyond your own mind. And of course, more than just doing meditation with other people, which again, in a secular scientific frame might make some sense for reasons of support. But opening yourself up to another entity in some way, expecting some kind of response, which I guess is what many people might feel is implied by prayer. I suppose that difference makes it harder to engage, and maybe, people actually not wanting to engage with that notion outside of explicitly religious circles. Although I also share your sense that even within religious circles, prayer is not very subtly taught, perhaps. And I can remember being taught the 4 different kinds of prayer, for example, which maybe you'll go on to. But I don't know how to really deepen and enrich a prayer life. I felt I was left floundering on that front really for many years, and it was only actually through doing a broadly Buddhist-based 3-year course on meditation that the idea of prayer developed and deepened for me.
Yes, well, that I think is indeed one of the key points. That the other contrast I wanted to make first really is the way I see prayer and meditation as complementary to each other. In meditation, you withdraw your attention from the world, you withdraw it from the external things going on around you. And then if it's mindfulness meditation, focus on sensations in the body and the breathing, or if it's mantra meditation, on the repetition of the mantra, creating a focus for attention. Then you see or allow thoughts to drift through your mind like clouds through the sky. And the idea really is to not be attached to thoughts or to anything external, and to come really for some moments to the ground of consciousness itself. So in other words, it's like breathing in. You're sort of withdrawing from the outer world and coming to the ground of consciousness itself. Whereas prayer is like the opposite. Petitionary prayer, I'm talking about, asking for things, the basic kind, or one of the most basic and common kinds, where you start with an invocation. You start by invoking a power or being greater than yourself. And as you say, for people who are hardcore atheists, that might be a problem because they don't think there is any consciousness greater than their own or that of other people. But for most people, including quite a lot of people who are spiritual but not religious, the idea of a greater consciousness, something greater than ourselves, is, they may not call it God, but a lot of people acknowledge there is something greater than ourselves. You start with an invocation, Our Father who art in heaven, Hail Mary, full of grace, come Holy Spirit, Om Namah Shivaya, O Allah. You start with an invocation to the God, Spirit, or being to whom you're praying. And then you have a series of intentions about the external world. Someone you know is sick, you pray for them to get better. Something you're worried about or afraid of, you ask for protection or help. Some challenge you're facing, you ask for courage to deal with it, or whatever. All the different things people ask for in prayer. So that's more like breathing out. You connect with the spiritual source and then direct your attention to specific problems or events in the outer world or in your body if you've got a pain somewhere that you're praying about. So the flow is in the opposite direction. And I think the breathing in and breathing out metaphor helps to make it clearer that it's not one or the other. You can't just breathe in and you can't just breathe out, that actually they're complementary. And I find that in my own life. I meditate practically every morning and I pray practically every evening before I go to bed. And I find the prayer part extremely helpful in the sense that it connects the spiritual life with day-to-day problems and events that are happening in my life from day to day and the life of my family and my friends and the wider world. Whereas meditation is more about withdrawing from them, disconnecting from them. And I think that if we only have meditation, then it's not necessarily going to help very much with day-to-day problems. If you only have prayer, then you're not necessarily going to go beyond day-to-day problems. And that's why I think you need both. So what I was really, the question I've been asking is, if people want to learn to pray who don't pray at all, just at the beginning level, how would they start? It's much harder than with meditation, because first of all, you have to invoke a being greater than yourself. And then secondly, how do you actually go about it? Who's going to teach you what to do? And, when I've asked various people, religious people, how do they teach prayer? They mostly come up with sort of very advanced sort of PhD level things like Ignatian exercises or very complex advanced forms of prayer. What I'm talking about is, how is it possible to teach prayer to beginners, e.g. children, young children? In one way is through doing, going to a church or cathedral and lighting a candle and making a wish, as it were. That's a very simple form where it involves actually doing something like lighting a candle. And I think that's really helpful exercise. But you can't do that on a daily basis necessarily. And when I brought this up at a seminar I was leading recently at a retreat center in Yorkshire, mostly of people who are Christian priests, ministers, Roman Catholic priests, people who teach in church schools and so on. I was hoping that they'd come up with a whole range of wonderful experience on how they'd done this, but actually I drew rather a blank. Most of them didn't seem to have much experience of teaching prayer. The people I thought were most experienced at it weren't. So anyway, I just wonder if you've ever tried teaching prayer to people, or what your thoughts are about this.
Yeah, I can't say I've ever tried to teach how to pray, but I have, I think, explored possibilities. So I too have a practice at the end of the day of praying. I actually use the form of service for Compline, night prayer, which is a rather beautiful way of creating a spirit that then takes you into the night. But it includes a time to pause and reflect on the day. And I use that time to hold in my mind those people that I've encountered during the course of the day, people who are particularly on my mind that I know are in trouble, and in fact people who I know who have died recently who are also on my mind, and pray for them as well. And the kind of praying there is a holding in mind. It's bringing a felt quality of that person's presence into my presence, and then offering that into God's presence. It feels like a sort of triangular motion almost. The one extra piece which I do increasingly add to that is actually praying for angels to be with people. I'm very fascinated by a woman called Lorna Byrne, who I think is a extraordinary seer of angels. I've spoken with her on a number of occasions, and have been very sort of compelled by the way she does that. I know that's a whole other area, but nonetheless, one of her rather amusing things that she says is that angels don't get called on so much anymore. And so asking angels to be with people, they're only too glad to receive that request. She often says it with a kind of smile on her face, and because it is a bit of a there's some wit there, but it reminds me that the angels have been called on for centuries, millennia, even in many different traditions, as kind of go-between entities, spirits that can bring comfort, that can bring messages, that again can help mediate the presence of God. And so I add that in as well. And in fact, Compline night prayer includes references to angels in the prayers, so it kind of fits in really quite well. So that's in terms of, I have a meditation practice in the morning too, which it's not so much a withdrawal. I actually sit before an icon of Jesus, and my sense is to be open to that presence, but without particular intention. I do use a bit of the sort of watching techniques from meditation, mindfulness meditation, but that's mostly just to be aware of my own inner churn and let that sort of do its normal thing, in order that I might be aware of moments when I feel a wider presence than just my own pretty familiar inner presence. So that's how I use my morning meditation. But I guess that that those will at least be a couple more that you might add to your sort of pocketbook of possible approaches.
Very good, Mark. Well, it's really interesting to hear that from you. And we've been talking together for years, and we've never discussed this before, at least not in such detail. And I think that's one of the interesting things about prayer, that there is a kind of taboo against discussing it or doing it. No, it's fascinating. And of course, I also ask the angels for help, particularly Saint Michael. But also the saints, because the saints are also intermediaries and go-betweens. And just as Lorna Byrne says that the world's full of underemployed angels just waiting to be asked for their help, I think there's probably never been a better time than the present to pray to the saints, because I think they're even more underemployed than the angels. And I actually do make a practice of wherever I am, I find out who the patron saint is, the patron saint of the parish. Right here, I'm in a village called Leonard Stanley in Gloucestershire, and the patron saint is St. Swithin. You may remember the old folklore about St. Swithin's Day, July the 15th. If it rains on St. Swithin's Day, it'll rain for 40 days afterwards. And I talked to a woman in the village this morning, and I said, did it rain here on St. Swithin's Day? And she said, yes. And it's been raining almost every day ever since.
Look, I mean, I like the wit around this, and there is something about the lightness of praying to entities, which actually I think is, not to be undervalued, because that lightness is itself a form of kind of openness and and readiness for what you might not expect. It sort of takes you out of your familiar assumptions, or at least it does do me. But at the same time, it does raise the question: what do we expect, or who do we even think? What do we think we're doing when we invoke? Maybe even more so these kind of more discrete spiritual beings. To invoke the name of God. Maybe there's a natural sense in which that's a very open, expansive, divine, universal sort of presence, the ground of being you mentioned there. And perhaps that's more understandable because we do have this sense of our being and presence, and so connecting consciously with that, at least intuitively makes some sort of sense. But to invoke St. Swithin or to call on an angel, I mean, how, if I can put it bluntly, how literally do you take that? Do you think, St. Swithin is a kind of symbol of the divine presence in that place? And so that you're in that place connects you to that long tradition of that particular form of divine engagement, if you like. Or, do you feel that St. Swithin in some way is given a particular charge over that place, and so it's kind of on the lookout for those who arrive?
Yes.
How you're right about the taboo. I think that's absolutely right, but maybe part of the taboo is digging a bit into what we actually think we're doing when we pray.
Well, it's a very ancient tradition that each place has its guardian spirit or tutelary spirit. I mean, the Romans thought that each place would have a tutelary spirit. The Tibetans think that, each valley, each area, each mountain has its protector. There's Bon protector spirits or various Tibetan gods and goddesses who are protectors of places. And I think that when Europe was Christianized, the idea of tutelary spirits was Christianized by having patron saints who are invoked as the protector spirit of that place. So now, then the question is, if people in this village have invoked St. Swithin for many centuries as their protector, and in my hometown, Newark-on-Trent, St. Mary Magdalene, who I regard as my patron saint, then what is the nature of these beings? Well, it slightly depends on how one thinks of the afterlife. If one thinks that that there is some kind of continued existence after death, I think of it as a kind of dreamlike state. Then this is not void of beings. I mean, it's full of entities, this after-death realm. And indeed, in your explorations of Dante, a lot of that is about exploring the after-death realms, of the inferno, of purgatory, and of paradise. There are beings in those after-death realms, including saints. When we discussed that, we were discussing, especially in the paradise thing, which is full of saints and angels, which Dante encounters as he travels through those realms. So if one assumes that in this after-death realm, there are certain beings who, instead of just passing through it and going out the other side into the state of ultimate bliss or whatever happens at the other end of this intermediate realm between this life and total paradise, if one assumes, as Christians do, that one of the leading figures in that realm is Jesus himself, resurrected from the dead, continuing to live in this other realm, able to help people after they've died. Then presumably the saints who model their lives on Christ would also have a continued existence in this after death realm, and be open to the prayers of people in this world and act as kind of intermediaries or helpers. Therefore, if one of them is actually invoked and asked to be the patron saint of a particular parish or a particular thing, institution, or of a particular person, then they may see it as their role to protect, guide, and look after them and be open to requests from them. So that's how I'd see it, as something of that kind. And so not just an archetype in the collective unconscious, not just an imaginary figure that helps us in our internal imaginary life. You could see it that way, but I see it much more literally as inhabiting an after-death realm to which we're likely to enter when we die. Now, of course, for an atheist who believes that when we die, there's just total oblivion, all of this is a childish fantasy. But for most people who think that there is some kind of survival of bodily death in one form or another, I think it makes quite a lot of sense. And even if one leaves out the saints and the angels, then the most primary form of prayer is directly to God. And of course, in the Christian tradition, we can pray to God under three aspects: God the Father, as in Our Father who art in heaven, the Lord's Prayer; God the Son, as in prayers addressed to Christ; and God the Holy Spirit, as in prayers addressed to the Holy Spirit. And all three are perfectly valid forms of prayer to God. So actually, there's quite a range of options for prayer. There's the three aspects of God, or the Holy Trinity as a whole. There's the saints and the angels, and that leaves a lot of entities to whom one can pray.
Yeah, I mean, Dante is very helpful for me on this, actually, because the way I've understood his experience of encountering saints, particularly in the paradise, is that particular saints, because of the lives they lived, know of God in their distinctive ways. So at one moment in the paradise, he encounters Peter, James, and John, the three apostles who are said to be closest to Jesus. And Peter, in the tradition, has become particularly associated with the nature of faith, James, particularly with the nature of hope, and then John, particularly with the nature of love. And what he sees in the paradise is that whilst we all have our distinctive relationship to God that's characterized by our experience, our personality, our times, how we've lived our lives, those individual paths are all paths to the one God, and that in the afterlife, our distinctiveness is not sort of annihilated into a sort of uniform kind of spiritual mush as if we're all the same, but actually our distinctiveness is kind of intensified, and that intensification becomes the path to the universal. So we become both more ourselves, and because of that, more connected to God, to whom we're connected anyway. And so it's a both and kind of approach. And so, Peter becomes associated with faith, and at that moment, Dante's able to explore his notion of faith, and the heavens sing as a result. Then James appears and they talk about love, and again the heavens sing at what Dante knows of that. And then John appears and they talk about love. So it is a bit like the three there are sort of tutelary spirits that help us to know of those kinds of aspects of divine life. Their particular presence or qualities or light helps ignite that quality or presence or light in us, and so aid us on our fuller participation in the divine. So I saints do get associated with different things, don't they? So maybe that's partly what's going on there.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, and I'm glad you've explained that because I didn't really notice that, even when I was reading your book about the Divine Comedy, which is so helpful. Um, yes, it's interesting, isn't it, that in psychedelic experiences, people often say they encounter entities, beings, seemingly autonomous beings in that imaginal realm, which is entered through taking the psychedelic or opened up to. Um, and it's a matter of great interest to a lot of people who take psychedelics. What is the nature of these entities? Are they autonomous? From the point of view of the standard materialist, secularist point of view, it's nonsense to think they're truly autonomous spirit entities. But so many people encounter them in these altered states of consciousness that the credibility of autonomous entities in the spirit world or the imaginal realm is, I think, becoming stronger and much more real for a lot of people. And I think that's another way into thinking about these beings like saints and angels. And I've never actually talked to people in psychedelic churches like Santo Daime, where an entire church where they take ayahuasca as a communion, what their experience of saints and angels is. But they'd be the most interesting people to discuss this with, I think, because there they actually cultivate the cult of the saints and the angels, and they have the altered states of consciousness in which they directly experience them.
Yeah, I mean, my take on this is that these traditions um, come with great traditions of discernment as well. It's not just like you take the drug and, bingo, an entity shows up and it's all quite straightforward. But there's a huge process of preparation, the ritual during the communion, and maybe the ongoing life afterwards as well. That's all about, in a way, not taking at face value what you first encounter, but having to sort of work with it, to integrate it, to maybe even put it to the test. In the ancient world, when people went to oracles, it was always a mistake to take the oracle at face value. You had to tease out what the subtler meaning was, and then that subtler meaning was the true revelation. So the famous example of this is Socrates, who gets a message from the Delphic oracle that no one's wiser than he. And if he'd taken that just at face value, that he was the super smart guy in Athens, we wouldn't be talking about him now. But what he does is he goes around and tries to find someone who's smarter than he is, who's wiser than he is, putting the oracle to the test. And then he understands something about the nature of his wisdom, which is that he knows of his ignorance. And that's the key to what the oracle was trying to say. And so I think that, maybe with this encountering autonomous entities and so on in psychedelic experience, it feels to me as if there's quite a lot of work yet to be done, both individually and then in a shared way, to really understand what's going on here. And the understanding, I think, will come by being transformed through the experience. It's not just a kind of objective study, but actually it's an invitation to step into a wider world that you have to change in order to be in that, in those different realms. And so it's a much more reflexive process that involves discernment as well as personal struggle, really.
Yes, and of course, not all the entities are friendly. I mean, there are malign entities too, and all traditional maps of the other world include demons and various and devils and so on. So they're certainly not all friendly.
Well, the mentioning there of malign entities also reminds me of another struggle I have, I suppose, with prayer, which is the question of suffering. Kind of, what do you pray for? Because I think that part of, in my experience anyway, why my church going kind of left me a bit floundering when it came to prayer is that it felt like there is the prayer of worship and praise, that makes sense to God. But when it came to more petitionary prayer, praying for others, it always felt like, asking for healing which, in sometimes can happen, but other times, clearly doesn't happen. And so the question of what happens when petitionary prayer appears not to work, I feel that is quite a stumbling block for people. But also the broader question, of suffering and the role of suffering in relation to prayer, which is why, for me now, I've sort of gone to this more holding in the presence notion. So I don't, as it were, to presume to know what might happen, whilst at the same time being open to what might happen. And similarly, if I go to a holy well or to a sacred place like to Candle, as you mentioned, I don't doubt that these places are associated with healing, but it feels important somehow to stay in a kind of in-between zone almost with these things. Maybe you could rationalize it as, suffering is a great mystery. We don't really understand certainly the extent of it. Some of our suffering we perhaps come to realize is our own doing, because of our psychology. But that doesn't really account for the extent of suffering that people undergo at all. So I feel that we have to just sort of hold a not knowing, well, maybe a bit like Socrates, a kind of ignorance in relation to that. But does that make sense to you, with petitionary prayer in particular?
Yes, I mean there's a big spectrum of experience about this. I mean, some people are very, very specific in what they pray for, very specific. Others, it's much more generic, holding people in the light or asking for blessings on someone. I mean, I actually do both. I sort of veer between these approaches, depending on the circumstances. So in praying for healing, it's not necessarily, I mean, obviously, if everyone who was prayed for to get better got better, no one would ever die, because people pray in all different religious traditions, in all cultural traditions, and healing is one of the things people pray for. And sometimes people do get better in a most surprising and perhaps miraculous way. But most of the time, in the end, they die. Otherwise, the world would be full of incredibly senescent old people. But that's true of modern medicine too. Modern medicine can work wonders, but in the end, everyone dies. So you could say in the end, it's a failure for everyone. So I think it's actually quite comparable to modern medicine, the power of prayer. It can work, and it works sometimes, doesn't work always, and certainly doesn't stave off death forever. So I think coming back to finally to the question of how to teach this. I mean, I've been reflecting on this for a while, and when I think about my own experience, I went through an atheist phase, and then I got interested in Hindu spirituality. I did transcendental meditation and yoga for quite a number of years. But when I felt drawn back to a Christian path, when I was actually living in India and working there, I started with the Lord's Prayer, and I found that actually for me was the best way in. And that's how I start my evening prayers every evening. I always start with the Lord's Prayer. And because it's a model of prayer that deals with different aspects of prayer, first of all, the acknowledgement of God and God's power, and then a series of prayers of a practical nature, the daily bread, our basic needs, and then forgiveness and the need to forgive others, and then protection, deliver us from evil, but always starting near the beginning with "Thy will be done," which is a kind of thing that makes it conditional on God's will. It's not just what we want. I find probably that for me is the basic model, really. And I suppose that in teaching people how to pray, in children, in schools and so on, probably teaching the Lord's Prayer might be the best starting point. I mean, it's the most obvious one. It's hardly controversial. And learning it by heart is something which I think is actually really helpful for children to learn. In a lot of secular families, they don't know it and they don't learn it by heart. But learning it by heart gives one a model for prayer that one can dust off and use when one feels one needs it. And one may go for years without praying, but then there'll be a circumstance when one feels one needs to pray, some threat or problem or crisis in one's life. And this would give everyone a starting point. So in the end, that was really one of the conclusions I've come to, that teaching the Lord's Prayer is probably the best way in.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can understand that with the structure. And, when I pray, thy will be done, it's a point of conversion, really, because you're asking, can I really pray that God's will rather than my will might be done? So it's a very active prayer. It's funny you should say that it's uncontroversial. Actually, I was just on the radio the other week because there had been a controversy about praying Our Father, for the understandable reason that if people have negative, even abusive experiences of earthly fathers, it's not going to be very helpful. And my point really was that God, because God is God, all sorts of names and ascriptions can be given to God. So Our Father is just a very profound, long-standing one in the Christian tradition, but so is Our Mother, actually, particularly the minute you get into the mystics, who understand that everything that we say is a means to a wider end rather than a literal end in itself. But my thought as well with that is that I think prayer responds to something very human in our spirit, which is the desire, not just for meditation and maybe in a calmer mind, valuable though that is, but a desire for devotion, for worship, for passion, for love. And that in its fullest ways is going to be a two-way process or a three-way process or a whole company of saints and angels as well. And it feels to me that however you come to understand that, or how you practice that, following that spirit of desire to participate in the fullness of life, is ultimately is going to be humanizing, and it's going to be therefore sort of part of the path back to God as well, because the more fully human we become, I believe, the more fully that we can know the divine presence. So just following that impulse, as well as the sort of training side of meditation, the two. Sometimes it's talked about, like you were talking at the beginning about how the breath in is sort of the Vedantic moment, and then the breath out is like the tantric moment, the participation in the richness of life. I feel like prayer can have those two moments as well.
Very good, Mark. Well, we could go on indefinitely on this very rich topic, but I think perhaps we better call it a day. But I really appreciate the fact that we could have this conversation, and I'm slightly surprised we haven't done it before, but it's such an important topic. So maybe we'll come back to aspects of this in the future.
Yeah, well, look, I appreciate the sort of personal side of it as well, and because we talk about lots of issues and things that fascinate us, but how we actually live the things we talk about is obviously really fundamental. So thank you.